you back to the conference. And it's nice to hear this buzz this early in the morning, this energy, which we will have transferred to our panel. My name is Gerard Atching, and I'm in the Department of Romance Studies, and I'm also the Director of Africana. And it's my pleasure to introduce this panel this morning, which is called the South of Diaspora, Francophone Literatures. And we have 4 speakers who we're very eager to listen to this morning. And what I will do is I will give their names, their titles, so that they will just follow the order as you have the order here in the program. So the first speaker will be Salim Ayoub from the University of Miami, and the title of his paper is Immigration, Global Influence and Alienation in the Literature of the South, the case of Fatou Diom, Le Ventre de l'Atlantique, followed by Céline Kodia from McGill University, and the title of her paper is In Search of the Afropean Soul. Our third speaker is Jacqueline Frost from here at Cornell University, and the title of her paper is The Sheer Tremendous Tidal Wave of Desperate Living, which is a quote, Édouard Glissant, Créolité, and the US South. And finally, Jonathan Solarte Espinosa from Harvard University, and the title of his paper is Tyranny of the Border, the Trujillo Massacre and the Modern Colonial Gender Binary in Edwidge Dantikas, The Farming of Bones. So without further ado, I'd like to have them come up here, and then we'll have time for questions afterward. So please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Okay, so my paper is called In Search of the Afropean Soul. In 2005, the suburb riot unveiled an unseen face of French society. These events, which were immediately referred to as social problems and not racial ones, brought light to forgotten French citizens, despite France's motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité. 10 years later, in 2015, the terrorist attack in Charlie Hebdo and in several Parisian locations challenged the fragile concept of French identity. In February 2016, a few months after the Paris terror attacks, French Parliament voted the highly criticized measures, allowing to strip from their citizenship French nationals convicted of terrorism and holding dual nationality. The contentious proposal, which even led the French Minister of Justice, Christiane Taubira, to resign her position, has been accused by its detractors of exacerbating division among French citizens and promoting the controversial notion of true Frenchness. During those heated debates, however, members of the African and Caribbean diasporas in France have had very few opportunities to let their voice be heard and share their concerns. My article will discuss Miano Fort's work, published in 2008, Afropean Souls and Other Stories. This book explores the theme of French identity, racial affiliation, nationalism, and social marginalization. Léonora Miano is a French language writer, born in Douala in 1973. Miano left her native Cameroon in 1981 to settle in Paris, where she has been living ever since. In interviews, Miano often expressed her interest for what she calls Afropean populations. That is to say, individuals from sub-Saharan Africa, French West Indies, or French Guiana living in Europe. In Afropean Soul, 5 narratives try to depict the daily lives of Afropean in France. Firstly, I will discuss the way Miano portrays incompatible identities, to then move on to the expression of trauma in the book. Finally, I will analyze the erasure of the subject in its relation to the French taboo of race. When reading Afropean Soul, the reader confronts a world of trauma, exclusion, and uncertainties. Thus, the first sentences of the book express the difficulty to confront the painful stories of Afropean communities. I know they're coming in. Although here, everything is dark, since the very first hour of the first day, I cannot come in. End of quote. The first story, since the very first hour, depuis la première heure, consists of a long soliloquy of a former soccer player from Cameroon whose dreams of success have been destroyed by an injury. In his narrative, he explains why he cannot go back to his native country nor assimilate into French society. Quote, I don't like this country. Nobody could help me. I miss my country with its colors, its perfume, seasons and fruits, wild mangoes, sour soaps, papaya. Cameroon is no paradise either. End quote. The narrator starts by asserting his sense of belonging. I miss my country. He then opposes Cameroon and the country is now living by referring to France as this country. Yet the idealized descriptions of Cameroon is cut short by the final sentence, Cameroon is no paradise either. These lines highlight the difficulty to find a place to call home, as well as they accentuate the character's distress and loneliness. Besides, it shows us the absence of solution for the narrator. The character barely keeps any connection with his home country, and he only has a fantasized image of the place he grew up in. However, there is no halfway, and the identities of the narrator as a French citizen and a national from Cameroon, or more precisely an illegal black worker, remain conflicting. As Professor Kathleen Knox claims it remains difficult today for an individual to conciliate French and black identities. Quote, the implication is that even if a black individual was born in France, his or her genealogical tree is rooted in other geographical places. Conversely, the expression often used to denote true Frenchness, français de souche, those of pure French stock, not only carries racial overtones, but it also evokes the image of a family tree, suggesting the complex entanglement between geography, genealogy, and national identity. End quote. This idea that in France, a black individual does not really belong is significant. As Knox points out, even for those born and raised in the country, black identity still clashes with the ambiguous black concept of true Frenchness. Hence, not only does Miano's work highlight the difficulty of fitting in, it also shows us the seemingly impossible reconciliation of diverse identities, as well as a form of race tyranny in a French context. I will now move on to my second part and discuss the expression of trauma in the book. In an essay called Critique de la raison nègre, historian Ashley Membe analyzes the figure of the Negro in its representations, origins, and impacts. On page 220, Membe states that, quote, an intimate relationship always linked the word Negro to death, murder, and burial. Obviously enough, this implies the order to both remain silent and not be seen. End of quote. This remark seems to perfectly fit the characters of Afropean soul. Voiceless, invisible, and lonely. They move about in the text like shadows. They wander in the streets, go to jobs they do not enjoy, and come back to their shabby shelters or home. There is no dialogue, and the only time a character somewhere interacts with the world is in the fourth story. The hero, an unnamed young black man, is drinking an espresso at a local coffee shop when a drunken client calls him out. Quote, Some must be sweating in their boo-boos. We will soon get rid of this vermin. End quote. The man who knows that he's being a victim of ordinary racism for the first time does not answer the racial slur. However, in his mind, he started a long, scholarly-like speech about nation, stigma, and the social implication of unemployment. Quote, he started asking himself how a pariah, someone even poorer than him, could believe things would get better for him if immigrants were to be deported. But the clothes factory will not reopen simply because the government would expel more undesirables. In these countries, individuals don't want to see the part of their own humanities in others. They only talk about immigration and nation and suggest that one could be standing the other. For him, immigration was part of national identity. It was a habit, a tradition, and a custom. Immigration made these people. This young man couldn't think differently. His identity, both spatial and rooted, couldn't be only national. This country was his. It was his only land. End of quote. Unlike the former soccer player in the first story, this character seems at peace. As opposed to the first story narrator, who referred to Cameroon as his country, this character claims to be French and only briefly mentioned his parents' country. As Léonora Miano argues in Habiter la Frontière, Afropeans have to embrace the in-betweenness in their identities. Quote, Black Europeans today refuse to have to choose between the sub-Saharan or Caribbean part of their identity and the European part. Rather, they wish to provide us shelter for both, to cherish them, to meander from one to the other, mix them together without having to hierarchize them. It is in the in-betweenness that they find themselves most comfortable, complete, and fulfilled. From what were once sites of rupture, they have created instead attachments in which the worlds they are made of touch one another without having to collide. End of quote. It appears that in Afropean Soul, although the characters apparently fit the stereotypes others have about them, they are constantly reinventing their identities. Yet for Miano, it seems that it is the action of vocalizing trauma that allows overcoming it. But how can one communicate distress when only inner speech is possible? Where can one safely express and speak up? Thus, the text plays a great role, as it becomes the character's niche, as well as a dedicated place for disobedience. Let's now move on to my final part, the erasure of the subject. One could argue that Miano's characters are not heroes per se. Illegal workers, single mothers, residents of the projects, victim of abuse, and outcast are the main protagonists of Afropean Soul. Still, there seems to be nothing special about them, their actions or their lives. Throughout the book, in a mix of internal and external vocalizations, the character's identity remains elusive, ghost-like. Miano's appears to be both drawing the contours and carefully erasing her protagonist. Hence, the author sketches out their personalities, barely mentions their physical appearances, and surprisingly, she chooses to leave most of them unnamed. Interestingly enough, in the fourth story, the main character mentions that his name at work is Dominique Dumas, a widespread, genderless French name is compelled to adopt in order to keep his job. The latter seems to underline both the loss of identity and the hypocrisy of the French Republic, which is claiming its blindness to race only when convenient. All characters, both present and absent, will therefore embody the abstract notion of race. Simultaneously unconceivable by the colorblind Republic and deeply anchored in French society, race remains in today's France a complex and taboo concept. As Achille Mbembe claims it, there has been in France a long tradition of erasing, relegating the violence of race to what does not deserve to be shown, to be known, or to be seen. Mbembe's statement raises interesting questions. For example, what happened to distress generated by race-related issues in a colorblind nation? Miano seemingly claims that in France, those questions are left unanswered or dismissed. Consequently, because those concerns cannot be expressed, they become all the more urgent and painful. The reader finishes the book with the impression that the character of Afropean soul are somehow extraordinary in their banality. The book quite obviously implies that issues surrounding Black communities in France have often been overlooked. These instant photographs, as Miano calls her stories, give us a glimpse into a community that does not seem to know yet what it is or where it stands. Ultimately, the reader understands that today, the Afropean soul still remains to be found. As Miano suggested, French Afropean will need time to overcome self-hatred, racism, and trauma in order to finally be at peace with themselves and embrace their identities. Besides, Afropean soul also invites the reader to think about society as a whole. By interweaving the I, the he, and the she, Miano creates the universal, unique voice of the us. Eventually, the focus is not individual stories, but the fate of an entire community, and more largely, the human experience.